Rich woman pretended to be blind to catches her black husband with his gay partner. What happens when the person you trust the most betrays you in the worst way possible? Christy's life was perfect, or so she thought, until she discovered the shocking truth about her husband and his hidden affair with his best friend. But the twists don't stop there. As Christy navigates heartbreak and anger, she finds herself torn between the man she once loved and the painful reality of his betrayal. Will she forgive him? Or will the lies be too much to overcome? Join us on a journey of betrayal, secrets, and self-discovery. Watch the full story to see how Christy takes control of her own future, and what happens when she decides to choose herself. If this is your first time here on our channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our amazing stories. Now let's jump into the full story. Christy had always thought of herself as a woman who could read people. At 33, her life had been one of privilege, success, and a seemingly perfect marriage to Buckman, a charming, ambitious 36-year-old businessman. But lately something felt off. Buckman had been coming home later and later, always claiming it was due to work meetings. At first, Christy believed him. After all, he was a hardworking man and his job was demanding. But as time passed, she noticed small things. How he would go silent when his phone buzzed, how his once open demeanor became distant. Christy tried to push aside her suspicions, telling herself that she was overthinking. Yet the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. One evening, as she watched him prepare for yet another late-night business meeting, Christy decided she had to know the truth. She had to find out what was really going on. The trust that once held their marriage together was beginning to crumble, and she needed to see if her suspicions were justified. Christy sat quietly in their bedroom watching Buckman get ready. He was talking about a new business venture, his voice full of excitement. But Christy's mind was elsewhere. What if he wasn't working? What if he was with someone else? The idea gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the thought of him hiding something from her. Suddenly an idea struck her. She could pretend to be blind. If she feigned blindness, Buckman would have to take care of her. He would be forced to show his true self, whether he cared for her or not. If he was faithful, he would become more attentive. If he was hiding something, his actions would speak louder than his words. It was risky, but Christy was tired of living in uncertainty. It was time to take control. The next day, Christy went to an ophthalmologist under the guise of needing an eye exam. She told the doctor she had developed sudden vision problems. The doctor confirmed that she might experience temporary sight loss due to stress and overexertion, offering her a pair of dark glasses as a precaution. Christy left the office, her mind already spinning with plans. When Buckman came home that evening, she greeted him as usual. But this time she wore the glasses. "I can't see clearly," she told him softly, her voice tinged with fake vulnerability. Buckman was taken aback, but he seemed genuinely concerned. "Don't worry," he said, helping her to the couch. Christy felt his touch and wondered if it was out of genuine care or if he was already beginning to feel the weight of her growing suspicion. A week later, Buckman's old friend Archipelago, who hadn't been around much lately, reappeared. Christy had heard of Archipelago before but never thought much of him. Buckman had spoken of him occasionally in passing, but there was never any mention of him coming around frequently. That changed when Archipelago began visiting the house almost daily. At first, Christy didn't think much of it. Archipelago was an outgoing man in his early 30s, who always had a pleasant demeanor. He was charismatic and Buckman seemed to light up when he spoke about him. Christy didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about their closeness made her uneasy. His visits were too frequent and they always seemed to find time alone. Christy couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between them than just friendship. As the days passed, Christy began to notice how different Buckman's behavior was when Archipelago was around. He was more attentive, more affectionate toward him, and always eager to spend time with him. The playful banter, the way they would joke around and touch each other casually, Christy couldn't help but feel the sting of jealousy. At first, she told herself she was imagining things. After all, she had never seen any physical signs of cheating. But something about their connection felt. One evening, while Archipelago was at their house, Christy overheard them talking in the kitchen. They were discussing some business venture, but their voices dropped to a softer, more intimate tone. Christy couldn't make out all the words, but she caught enough to know there was more to this relationship than just business. Later that week, Christy overheard another conversation, this time between Buckman and Archipelago in the living room. She sat quietly on the couch, pretending not to notice as the two men laughed. Christy strained to listen as Archipelago spoke. "I miss our late-night talks, Buckman. You always know how to calm me down," he said, his tone almost tender. Buckman chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, work has been crazy lately. But I'm glad you're here, man. You know I appreciate our friendship." Christy's stomach churned. The conversation seemed harmless on the surface, but there was something too close, too personal in the way they spoke. He had to know for sure. She couldn't live in this kind of uncertainty. It was time to gather more information. That evening, after dinner, Christy decided it was time to confront Buckman. She hadn't yet revealed that she knew anything, so she decided to test him, keeping up the blind act. "I've noticed something, Buckman," Christy said quietly, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "I feel like you've been hiding something from me. Something that doesn't feel right." Buckman froze. He knew exactly what she was implying. He started to deny it, his words stumbling over each other. "What are you talking about, Christy? You know I'm always working." "I don't believe you anymore," Christy said softly, her heart pounding. "I need the truth, Buckman." The silence that followed was suffocating. Christy could feel his guilt in the air. Finally he spoke. Buckman sat down beside her, his face pale and troubled. He looked like a man cornered, caught between the truth and his lies. "Christy, I never meant for you to find out this way," he said, his voice low. "But I have to be honest with you. I've been seeing someone." "Archipelago." Christy's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words hit her like a freight train. "What do you mean?" "You've been seeing him, like romantically?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Buckman nodded, his face flushed with shame. "Yes, Christy. I didn't plan for it to happen. It just did." Christy's heart broke as the truth sank in. She had suspected it all along, but hearing him say it out loud was crushing. Christy sat motionless, her mind racing as Buckman's confession hung in the air. She had suspected something was going on, but hearing him admit it felt like a punch to the gut. The man she had built a life with, the man she had trusted more than anyone, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. She wanted to cry, to scream, but instead she took a deep breath and steadied herself. "Why Buckman? Why Archipelago? What did he give you that I didn't?" she whispered, trying to make sense of his choices. Buckman lowered his head, his face full of regret. "I don't know. It just happened. We've been friends for years, but somewhere along the way it became more. I never meant for it to hurt you, Christy. I never wanted this to tear us apart." Tears filled Christy's eyes as she tried to hold them back. "How could you do this to me?" "To us?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "You didn't even think about what this would do to me, to our marriage. We had everything, Buckman. Everything." The silence between them was deafening. Christy's mind was spinning, replaying every moment she thought she had with him, every instance where he'd been distant, every late night he came home smelling like someone else's perfume. The betrayal was bigger than just Archipelago. It was the lies, the deception, and the utter disregard for her feelings. Unable to keep it in, Christy stood up suddenly, her breath shallow. "I need some space, Buckman. I can't look at you right now." She turned and walked away, leaving him sitting there in the living room, his head buried in his hands. Later that evening, Christy found herself staring out the window, questioning everything she had known about her life and her marriage. This wasn't the future she had imagined. How would she ever trust again? The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Christy. She couldn't shake the image of Buckman sitting there, his face full of regret, pleading for forgiveness. It all felt like a nightmare. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her heart, had shattered it into pieces. The anger inside her bubbled, threatening to spill over. But instead of confronting him immediately, Christy chose silence. The silence gave her time to think, to reflect, and to rebuild the strength she had lost. Buckman continued to call, to send messages, desperate for her to speak to him, to allow him back into her life. But Christy didn't want to hear it. Each message from him only reminded her of the betrayal. She knew that words alone could never undo the damage that had been done. She had once believed in the power of their love, but now it all seemed like an illusion. Archipelago, too, had reached out, apologizing profusely for his part in the affair. He claimed that he never meant for things to get so complicated, that he never intended to hurt her. Christy was torn. He wasn't the one who had made vows to her, and in the end he was just as much a victim of Buckman's deception as she had been. But Christy couldn't shake the feeling that Archipelago in his own way had contributed to the mess. He had known about her marriage, known about the vows she had taken, and yet he had allowed himself to become involved. For the first time in years, Christy allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fury. She had been betrayed by the two people she thought she could trust the most. She wasn't sure what to do next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let them off easily. She couldn't. The storm inside her was just beginning. Christy spent the following days in a haze of emotions. Anger, sadness, disbelief. She couldn't bring herself to look at Buckman or Archipelago, but she could feel their presence haunting her at every corner. As she moved through the motions of her daily life, everything felt different, like the world around her had shifted and left her behind. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. It was as though the walls themselves had witnessed her betrayal and now echoed with its presence. One evening, as Christy was alone in the living room, she heard a soft knock at the door. She froze. It was Buckman. She hadn't expected him to come back, not after the last time. Her heart pounded in her chest. With a deep breath, she walked to the door and opened it, her face a mask of calm that betrayed the storm inside. "Christy, please. Just listen to me," Buckman pleaded, standing on the doorstep, his hands clasped tightly together. His eyes were full of regret, and for a brief moment, Christy almost believed he was truly sorry. But then the reality of what he had done crashed back into her mind, and the mask of calm she wore slipped away. "Why, Buckman? Why did you think this was okay?" Christy's voice cracked. She was done holding it together for him. "You lied to me. You betrayed me. You chose him over me." Buckman stepped forward, but Christy held her ground. "Don't come any closer. I don't want to hear it anymore. Your actions have already spoken louder than any apology could ever be." His face fell, the weight of her words sinking in. He opened his mouth to speak but found himself lost for words. "I need space," Christy said, closing the door softly, leaving Buckman standing there. The fury inside her was still simmering, but now it was mixed with a deep sense of sadness. She had been so wrong about everything. Her life, her love. It was all falling apart. Christy spent the next few days trying to regain some sense of control. She spent hours in the comfort of her study, sifting through paperwork and old memories. The house, though large and luxurious, now felt cold and alien to her. The silence between her and Buckman stretched on, and she found herself questioning everything: her choices, her marriage, and even her own judgment. Despite her resolve, doubts began to creep in. What if Buckman was truly sorry? What if, deep down, he regretted his actions? She'd seen glimpses of the man she fell in love with. The gentle gestures, the soft whispers, the way he made her laugh. Could that person still be in him, or had he completely changed? One evening, she stood by the window looking out at the city lights, her mind spinning. The weight of the decision she had to make was almost unbearable. To forgive him and allow him back into her life would require more than just words. It would take trust. Trust that had been completely shattered. The mere thought of giving him another chance sent a wave of nausea through her. Could she truly rebuild what they had, or was it forever broken? As she sat on the couch, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Archipelago. "I know you're angry, Christy, but I need to talk to you. I never meant to hurt you. I don't want to be the cause of your pain. Please just let me explain." Christy hesitated, her finger hovering over the reply button. Part of her wanted to respond, to hear his side of the story, to understand why it all had to happen. But another part of her screamed in protest. Archipelago had been part of the betrayal, part of the wreckage that now defined her life. With a sigh, she turned the phone off and leaned back into the couch, staring at the empty room. She wasn't ready for any more answers. Not yet. The days seemed to drag on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Christy's life had become a routine of silence and distance. She avoided Buckman's calls and ignored his messages. She had created a barrier around herself, not just from him but from the world. In the midst of her inner turmoil, she found herself slipping further into isolation. One afternoon, while Christy was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, there was another knock on the door. This time it wasn't Buckman. It was Archipelago. Christy's heart skipped a beat. She had no intention of seeing him, but something in the pit of her stomach told her this was inevitable. She didn't want to hear any more excuses or apologies, but she couldn't deny the curiosity that gnawed at her. With a deep breath, she opened the door. "I didn't expect to see you," Christy said, her voice cold but composed. Archipelago stood on the doorstep looking a bit nervous, a small bouquet of flowers in his hand. I know this is hard, Christy. I didn't come to make things worse. I just need to apologize. To you. Christy didn't invite him inside, but she didn't slam the door either. She stood there waiting for him to continue. I've spent the last few weeks reflecting on everything, Archipelago said, his voice sincere. I never meant for any of this to happen. I'm not proud of how things turned out and I can't undo the hurt I've caused you. But I want you to know that I never wanted to be the reason for your pain. I should have stayed away. Christy crossed her arms, her gaze unyielding. You should have. But you didn't. And now you're here standing in front of me offering flowers. It doesn't change what happened, Archipelago. None of this does. Archipelago's face softened. I know. But I need to ask you something. Something I should have asked sooner. He paused, then looked her in the eye. Can you forgive me? Christy stood silent for a moment, contemplating the question. Could she? Christy stood still, the weight of Archipelago's question pressing down on her chest. Can you forgive me? The question seemed simple enough, yet it carried so much more. It wasn't just about forgiving him. It was about forgiving herself, about letting go of the deep betrayal that had shaken the foundation of her life. She stared at the bouquet in his hands, the flowers a small token of remorse that could never erase the pain she felt. The past few weeks had been an emotional whirlwind. She had cried, shouted, and silently agonized over Buckman's affair. But the question remained, could she truly forgive anyone involved in this mess? I don't know, Christy said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. I'm angry, Archipelago. I'm angry at Buckman, at you, at myself. This was never supposed to happen. Archipelago lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. I understand. I'm not asking you to forget. I don't think I could forgive myself either. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. I really am. For everything. Christy felt a flicker of empathy, but it was buried beneath layers of pain and disillusionment. It's not just about the apology, Archipelago, she replied, struggling to find the right words. You both betrayed me. You knew I was married, knew Buckman had committed himself to me, and yet you got involved. You made a choice just like he did. And that hurts. He nodded, his face pale. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, if ever. I just thought you should hear it from me. I'm sorry for what I did to you. Christy took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. Forgiveness. The word echoed in her mind, but it didn't feel like it belonged to her just yet. I need time, she finally said, her voice steady but firm. I'm not ready to forgive anyone. Not right now. With that, she gently closed the door. Archipelago stood there, still holding the flowers, the silence between them more deafening than words ever could be. The days after Archipelago's visit passed in a blur. Christy didn't feel any relief after their conversation, and in some ways it made things harder. She was trapped between the past and the future, unsure of which way to go. Her thoughts were consumed by what had happened, and each attempt to move forward only seemed to pull her back into the same dark place. Buckman's presence loomed over her like a shadow. Though he hadn't physically returned to the house, Christy could feel the weight of his absence. She could hear his voice in the back of her mind, apologizing over and over, but it didn't change the reality. He had betrayed her in ways that she couldn't easily forget. She still had to come to terms with everything that had happened, but right now she was too raw, too vulnerable to think clearly. One evening, while Christy was sitting in the living room, her phone buzzed. She stared at the screen, her heart skipping when she saw Buckman's name. She had resisted answering his calls for weeks, but this time, something in her told her that she had to speak to him. The truth, all of it, had to come out. With a deep breath, she answered. Christy, Buckman's voice came through the phone, full of exhaustion and remorse. I can't keep living like this. I know I've destroyed everything between us, but I need to explain myself. I need you to hear me out. Christy closed her eyes, bracing herself. She had heard these words before, too many times. But there was a part of her that wanted closure, wanted to understand what had driven him to betray her trust. Buckman, she said, her voice steady, I've already heard everything you've had to say. What more could there possibly be? He was quiet for a moment. I never wanted to hurt you, Christy. But I never knew how to stop. I loved you and I still do. But Archipelago, he made me feel things I thought I couldn't feel anymore. I was lost. Christy's heart twisted in a way she didn't expect. Christy felt a strange mix of anger and sorrow as Buckman's words echoed in her mind. I was lost. She had heard him say it before, but this time, it didn't feel like just an excuse. It felt like a confession. A confession of guilt, regret, and perhaps even a glimpse of the truth she had been searching for. I don't know if I can ever believe you again, Buckman, she said, her voice a mixture of weariness and resolve. How do you expect me to look at you the same way again? How can you say you love me and still do this? There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Christy could hear Buckman's breathing, steady but filled with emotion. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I know that's not something I can just demand. But I need you to know that I'm truly sorry. I wasn't the man you thought I was. I didn't want to hurt you, Christy. I just didn't know how to handle my own feelings, and I ended up hurting the one person I've always loved. Christy's mind was spinning. She felt an intense ache in her chest, a pain that had been festering since the moment she discovered the affair. She wanted to scream at him to tell him that none of this mattered anymore. But there was a part of her, deep down, that wanted to believe his words. Could I ever trust him again? He wasn't sure. I need time, Buckman, Christy said quietly, her heart heavy. Time to figure out what I need to do, what I want. Right now I can't make any decisions. Everything feels too broken. He didn't argue. Instead he simply said, I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here if you need me. Christy ended the call, the silence pressing in around her like a thick fog. She sat on the couch, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. Could forgiveness ever be part of her future? Or was this the end of the road for them? The next few days were a blur of indecision and emotional exhaustion. Christy spent her time in a fog, moving through the motions of life without really engaging in it. She went to work, attended meetings, but every moment felt like it was happening to someone else. She was no longer sure who she was, who she had been. She couldn't shake the feeling that the life she had built had been ripped apart in an instant, leaving only fragments in its wake. That evening, Christy sat on the balcony, staring at the city lights as the cool night air wrapped around her. The house was eerily quiet without Buckman's presence. She hadn't seen him in days, but she could feel him everywhere. His absence felt more present than his physical presence ever had. She wondered if that was a sign that the emotional connection they once shared had been irrevocably broken, if the man she had known and loved was no longer the same person. Her thoughts turned again to Archipelago. She hadn't heard from him since their brief conversation, and while part of her had wanted to speak with him further, another part of her couldn't face him. She couldn't reconcile the man she had once trusted with the betrayal he had been part of. Was he truly sorry? Did it matter? After all, he had known about her marriage, about her commitment to Buckman. He should have stayed away. Just as she began to spiral into self-doubt, her phone rang. Christy hesitated before answering, but the name on the screen was unexpected. Archipelago. Christy, I know you're probably tired of hearing from me. His voice came through, soft and apologetic. But I need you to know that what happened between Buckman and me, it was a mistake. I never should have let it get this far. Christy's heart raced. She had braced herself for a conversation like this, but hearing it again made everything feel raw once more. Why, Archipelago? Why did it have to happen this way? She asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound steady. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Archipelago responded. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of guilt that hung between them. I don't have a good answer for you, Christy, he said quietly. I wish I could explain it in a way that made sense, but I can't. It was wrong. All of it. But the truth is, I got caught up in something I didn't understand myself. Buckman and I, we were close, and somewhere along the way I let things get blurred. I let myself fall into something that wasn't right. Christy closed her eyes, a deep sigh escaping her lips. The raw honesty in his words tugged at her heart, but the hurt was still there, festering beneath the surface. I trusted you both, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You knew me. You knew my life with Buckman. You knew how much I loved him. And you still let it happen. How am I supposed to make sense of that? She could almost hear the pain in Archipelago's voice as he responded. I didn't think about the consequences, Christy. I was selfish. I thought I could be part of something that wasn't mine, and I thought I could walk away without anyone getting hurt. I was wrong. I see that now. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't deserve any of this. Christy's mind raced. She had been so focused on her own pain and betrayal that it hadn't occurred to her that Archipelago might be suffering too. But did it matter? Was it enough to make her forgive him? Or even to forgive Buckman? The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of raw emotion, and she felt as if she was losing herself in it. Could she forgive them? Could she even trust herself to make that decision? "I don't know what to do," Christy whispered, feeling more lost than ever. "I don't know if I can forgive either of you." There was a long silence, and then Archipelago spoke again, softer this time. "Take your time, Christy. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Christy stared out into the dark city skyline, unsure of where her heart would lead her next. The next few days passed slowly, each one stretching on in a blur of unanswered questions and overwhelming emotions. Christy had spent most of her time alone, trying to make sense of everything. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying every moment, every conversation, trying to find the piece of the puzzle that would explain how everything had gone so wrong. Buckman continued to call, to send texts, but Christy kept him at arm's length. The anger still simmered inside her, but it was overshadowed by a deep sense of confusion. How could she reconcile the man she had loved, the man who had promised to stand by her, with the man who had betrayed her so completely? She didn't know the answer, and it frightened her to think that she might never find peace with it. Archipelago's apology echoed in her mind as well. She understood that he was sorry, but the damage had already been done. How do you forgive someone who helped tear apart your life? He wondered. His sincerity had been evident, but was that enough? Would she ever be able to see him without the weight of what he had done between them? As Christy sat in her living room one evening, the phone buzzed again. It was a message from Buckman. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but I want you to know I'm not giving up. I'm going to fight for us, Christy. If you let me, I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again." Christy stared at the words, her heart heavy. She had heard this before, hadn't she? Buckman had promised before that things would change, that he would be different. And yet here they were, again. His promises felt hollow now, tainted by the betrayal. For a moment she felt torn between the love she had once shared with him and the person he had become. But Christy knew one thing for certain. She couldn't make this decision overnight. The road ahead would be long, and she didn't yet know which direction to take. She closed her eyes, knowing that the healing process, if it ever came, would take time she wasn't ready to give. Not yet. Weeks passed, and with each day, Christy found herself a little less consumed by the anger that had clouded her mind. But even as time offered some relief, the truth still lingered, heavy, unresolved, and unshakable. Christy had taken the space she needed, away from Buckman and Archipelago, to reflect on her past and her future. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was necessary. As much as she wanted answers, what she needed most was clarity. She had spent so much time trying to figure out where Buckman had gone wrong, or how Archipelago could have been part of their betrayal, that she had neglected to ask the most important question of all. What did she want for herself? One afternoon, Christy sat in the park, the sun shining brightly overhead. The world seemed to go on as usual. Children laughed as they played, couples strolled hand in hand, and the air was filled with the hum of life. For the first time in weeks, Christy felt a sense of peace. She realized that her decision, whatever it might be, had to be her own. She couldn't live in the shadow of someone else's mistakes. Buckman had promised to fight for her, to earn back her trust. But Christy knew now that trust wasn't something that could be regained in a few weeks or even a few months. It wasn't something that could be earned back with words or promises. Trust had to be built, brick by brick, over time, and Christy wasn't sure if she was willing to take that chance with Buckman anymore. She pulled out her phone and looked at the messages from him once more. His words were full of regret, full of promises to change. She felt nothing but sadness as she stared at them. There was a part of her that still loved him, that still wanted to believe that he could be the man he once was. But that part of her had begun to fade. She had changed too, and she couldn't go back to what she once knew. With a steady hand, Christy typed her response. "Buckman, I appreciate your efforts, but I don't think we can go back to what we had. I need to move forward, and I need to do that on my own. I hope you find peace, but I can't be the person to give it to you. I've spent so long waiting for things to get better. But now I have to choose myself. Goodbye." She pressed send. As Christy placed her phone back in her bag, a strange sense of relief washed over her. The weight that had held her down for so long was finally lifting. It wasn't an easy decision. Nothing about this journey had been easy, but it was the right one. She wasn't running away from the pain, but she was choosing to walk forward, even if she didn't know exactly where that path would lead. In the days that followed, Christy took her time to focus on herself. She reconnected with old friends, spent time doing things that brought her joy, and began to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage. The process wasn't instant. It wasn't as if the hurt disappeared overnight. But it was healing. And with each passing day, Christy felt stronger. She had taken control of her own life, and for the first time in a long while she felt empowered. As the weeks turned into months, Christy moved into a new chapter of her life. Buckman's calls became less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. She didn't resent him, she didn't have the energy for that anymore. Instead, she found that the best thing she could do was wish him well from a distance, hoping he too could find his own healing. One evening, as Christy walked down the street, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun set, she smiled softly to herself. She didn't have all the answers, and there were still moments of sadness. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. She had taken the hardest step, the one that had terrified her the most. She had chosen herself. And that was enough.